I used to work in an electricity company, Pacific Gas and Electric. I worked in the energy business a lot in the early part of my career. And if you just look at the energy system as a whole, it seems like something that could never be changed. It is the way it is. Things are literally set in concrete, but in fact, it is changing. It can change. The trick is to find the cracks and work there.
I think most people who think about systems think about finding a crack and expanding the crack, as in exacerbating what's already not working, hauling highlight to it. And what you did in the story is the reverse direction.
Obviously, changing systems isn't something that any one person can do. You're always working with others. So the question I wanted to ask is,
there is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone.
All right, welcome to the conversation. So systems are usually incredibly well intended, but over time they end up creating more hassle than the often value. And you'll see this in your own work life, in your corporation. All the layers of protection and checks and balances and approvals and so on seem to become incredibly burdensome, even though they were started for a good intent. You'll also see that in government systems. You'll see that in various social systems. You see that in just about everywhere you look these days. Often we think as an individual that there is nothing that we can do to change the systems that frustrate us so much, whether that's at work or whether that's at society. However, the good news for today is there are actually things that you as an individual can do. And in fact, there are 7 habits that you can deploy. Now, that's what we're going to talk about. What are they and how do you use them? And these are all insights from one of my favorite people who really is responsible for helping enemies collaborate. So Adam Kahane is a leading organizer, designer, facilitator of processes through which just about everybody in the world works. Business, government, civil leaders, as well as over 50 countries in every part of the world, executives, politicians, generals and guerrillas, civil servants and trade unionists, community activists and UN officials, clergy and artists. As I said, bringing anybody together, particularly when they have a very strong difference of opinion. He's a member of the Order of Canada, and in 1922, he was named the Schwab Foundation Social Innovation Thought Leader of the Year at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The book we're talking about today, Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems, the Catalytic Power of Radical Engagement. So Adam, welcome back to the podcast again.
Thank you, Wanda. Happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I am a big fan, as I know many people are, of your work. And I consider myself a reasonable expert on this whole notion of how do we get people who have differences of opinions to work together in an effective manner. But you take it to a whole other level from my point of view. So bringing together people who have intense disagreements and really truly helping them move forward. So we've talked about that work, collaborating with the enemies, and I know you're working on a revision of that book as well. But why this particular book focused on what individuals can do?
Well, maybe just to start off by commenting on some of the things you've said. I'm not down on systems. Nothing would get done without systems. We wouldn't have homes or electricity or food or clothing. So we need to organize for things to fit together to deliver results. But it is true that sometimes they just don't do what they need to do, or more precisely, they work well for some people but not well for others. So that's what I'm interested in, and we'll come back to this question about collaborating with the enemy a bit later. But there were 2 reasons why I wrote this book. The first is this general sense that many people have, and that I was also beginning to have, that there's lots of systems that we've built, we, the royal we, over the years, that I always thought were just the way things are, but they're not just the way things are. They were built by humans, they can be rebuilt by humans, and they're not working very well for a lot of people. And whether that's the system for burning fossil fuels to to create energy, whether it's the system for providing jobs, whether it's uh, our economic system, our democracies, our way of living together on planet Earth. There's lots of uh, lots of sense that things need to change, and uh, I've worked a lot on that over the years. And obviously, changing systems isn't something that any one person can do. Uh, you're always working with others. So the question I wanted to ask is, okay, we know it's a collective activity, but what does each person need to do? And not just once in a while, but on an everyday basis. So that was half of the answer about how I got started with this book. The more particular answer is I got started in this work, which, as you said, I've done all over the world, but I got started in this work 30 years ago in South Africa, when a lot of people were trying to change the racial segregation of apartheid to the democracy that occurred in 1994. And one of the people I have worked with from the beginning is a well-known South African politician named Trevor Manuel. And 3 years ago, or I guess 3.5 years ago now, I interviewed him, um, and it was a very bad interview in the sense that I had just written a book. I think it's the one you and I spoke about last time, called Facilitating Breakthrough. And I was trying in the interview to get him to agree with me about what I'd written, and he was talking about something completely different. So it was a 30-minute interview, and it just didn't go well. As soon as it ended, it was a live interview. My wife and my business partners all sent me messages saying, "Terrible interview. Don't quit your day job." And and so it got me thinking, as these situations normally do, like, what was I missing? And I realized what I was missing is that I had a grand, or let's say a high level view of how systems change. But Trevor was trying to explain to me what he and others, but particularly his own experience, what he had done day to day in that period of South African history, and how he had, gone to meetings with business people during the day, and then students, and then party leaders at night, and just over and over trying to engage with people to find a way to move forward. And I realized I didn't understand what the everyday habits were, and I really that it would be useful for other people to understand it, but also for me to understand it. So that was the impetus for writing this book, which, as you say, is called Everyday Habits for Transforming Systems.
So let me go back to the beginning. I don't disagree with you about systems. We need systems. And you speak about this in terms of government systems or social systems. I think they're just as relevant inside the workplace, because I watch an awful lot of people. So we have risk profiling systems inside every company I work in. We need those. That's appropriate. But they also create enormous frustration. And so I think I love the focus that you have in terms of society, but I want everybody to recognize that it's just as applicable inside the
Yeah,
organization
yeah,
that you work, in the community that you're in, as well as in the large social system. That's response number one. Response number two is there are two people that I have interviewed in the past who've talked about making, like most recently was Amy Rothenberg, talking about getting a particular legislation through Massachusetts. And what is striking about that work, every time you listen to anybody interview, kind of like Trevor, you end up with this long, slow, steady burn, where part of it is keeping the patience and just keeping pushing on all the different
yeah,
angles over and
yeah.
over. And I think that's part of what you're saying in your everyday habits. Am I right or wrong?
Yes, that is, in fact, the seventh of the seven habits, persevering and resting. So, yes, to understand that most of the systems we're talking about were built over long periods and aren't going to change quickly unless you just want to blow them up. And I'm think generally just blowing things up is not doesn't get good results. Maybe there's exceptions. Um, so yes, I think persevering's part of it. But beyond that, the question is, what do you do? How do you figure out? How do you fit? Yes, it takes a while, but how do you figure out what to do day to day? And so those are the previous six habits. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I understand the interview with Trevor. After all of this work, what convinces you that individuals can truly make a difference in these large systems?
Well, I don't know any other way to think about it. Who is there other than individuals? I mean, I'm not saying individuals acting alone, but I can't think of any examples of things happening other than by individuals in collectives making things happen. I mean, unless you're talking about AI changing systems, it's all about people. I had a yeah. So I don't really understand the question. I'm not saying one person can change anything, but I am saying that each person needs to do something. And the question I'm asking is, what does each person need to do day to day for the group, for the collective to affect the transformation of a given system?
Yeah, I think there are two angles I was looking for out of my question. So let me rephrase both of them. Granted that nobody changes a big system all by themselves unless you're trying to blow something up. And I would even argue AI has censored humans at the end of it in one place or another. But okay, so we all need collective. But the point is, one person can initiate that collective. One person can keep the collective going. One person can bring more people into the collective. So it's that sense of an individual action that moves the collective to a new place. That was one point of the comment. Second point of the comment is much more about hope. I talk to a lot of people who feel more hopeless than in prior years about the state of the world in general and the state of their organizations. So this sense of an individuals can have daily habits that help systems change, to me, is a message of hope. And what I want to know is, do you feel that way as well?
Yes, other people have written more eloquently than I have about hope, Rebecca Solnit in particular. Uh, but yes, I guess the other word I would use is agency. We can each do something. And again, to come back to the first part of the way you rephrased it, I'm not focusing on one person initiating or sustaining. I'm just making uh, I guess you could say, ordinary and obvious point that if there's a bunch of people trying to change things, each of them is doing something. Each of them has agency. They're not sitting around waiting for others to do things. And so the question I'm trying to ask is, what guidance can we give to each of those people so that they can be effective rather than wasting their time and energy? And yes, I do think, or my experience is, that when people realize, hey, I might not be able to do it by myself, but I can make a contribution. I have agency. I have the capacity to have influence working with others. Then yes, that's different from there's nothing I can do. I should just wait until somebody does something.
Right. And I think it's what we know from all the resilience work is that a sense of agency is one of the key components for building resilience. There are a couple of others, but that is just like an essential one. All right. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, what do you mean by a system?
Well, I knew you were going to ask me that, so I opened to page 10, and I, I'm not trying to survey the academic literature, but there is a very good writer on systems from a long time ago, a woman named Donella Meadows, who wrote a book, I think it's called Seeing Systems. But her definition makes perfect sense to me. A set of elements that's structured intentionally or otherwise to achieve a purpose or produce a characteristic system pattern of behavior. So you were talking about company systems. There's systems that enable bills to get paid. There's certain people performing certain functions with certain computers and certain procedures that produces a characteristic set of behavior. In that case, that the bills get paid and don't get lost. And so the interesting part of her definition is that there's elements, individuals, objects, rules, and there's relationships. And she makes the very interesting point, I think very crucial point, that it's not just about the individuals. Often if you have a system and you change the individual, the pattern of behavior doesn't change at all. It's the individuals in relationship. So that's what I mean by a system, whether it's a bill paying system or an energy producing system or a election running system or a closed distribution system. They all have these characteristics. And my question is, how can we not just tweak them, which is sometimes adequate, but often not adequate? How can we transform them so they produce fundamentally different patterns of behavior, and in particular, so they work better for more people?
That definition of systems is very close to what some might describe as culture. So I just make that note that that's sort of how it feels very similar. Okay, so let's dive into these habits. There are 7 of them that you believe that individuals who are in a collective process trying to transform a system of any place and anywhere, so elements, objects, people, doing behaviors that achieve a purpose and an outcome. Things that individuals in that system need to each do in order to have the best shot at the transformation. So what are those habits? Just give me the list of them.
Okay, well, again, you'd think I would remember this, having spent a year on it, but let me open up to the table of contents. And so here's the list of 7, and then we can talk about whichever of them that you think is most interesting. Number 1, acting responsibly. Number 2, relating in 3 dimensions. Number 3, looking for what's unseen. Number 4, working with cracks. Number 5, experimenting a way forward. Number 6, collaborating with unlike others. And number 7, the one I mentioned, persevering and resting.
Wow, there's a long list. Acting responsibly, relating in 3 dimensions, looking for the unseen, working with the cracks, experimenting a way forward, collaborating with unlike others, and perseverance. Okay, great.
Persevering and resting, yeah.
And resting,
Both.
yes, because that is part of persevering. It requires that to do.
Yeah.
So I want to start with one. So let's start in the middle, which is maybe unlikely a place to begin. But this notion of working with cracks, what does that mean? How does that work? And give me an example.
So you've picked one that's my favorite, or I guess a better way to say it is the one that I wasn't thinking of before I started the research for this book. And I noticed that this image or this metaphor of cracks was being used a lot. I'm a Montrealer, so by contract, I'm obliged to quote Leonard Cohen in any interview. And of course, he has a famous line. I think it's I think the song's called Anthem, where he says, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And anyhow, other people have used this metaphor. I think the most accurate analogy would be a rock climber going up the side of a mountain. Rock climber doesn't just attack the mountain or climb up the mountain as a whole. The rock climber finds cracks for her handhold or footholds, and as through that makes her way up the mountain. So the idea is that we think of systems as these eternal, perfectly fitting together things where you have to just blow them up or take a sledgehammer to them, which you can do, but that has risks, which we alluded to a little while ago. And what I think is a more promising way of looking at it is actually systems are always changing. There's always things that are bright spots where something's working better, or problems where things are not working well. These are cracks. And the idea of working with cracks is to find the places where things are already moving and work there to get a handhold, as it were. And the example, one of the examples I give in the book is I've worked a lot with Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, which is a quite important energy think tank in the United States. And we worked a lot on something called the Electricity Transformation Lab, which was about how to shift U.S. electricity systems towards more renewable and distributed forms of electricity, which, by the way, is something which has moved much more quickly than I ever thought was possible. I think, if memory serves me right, more than half the generation in the US is now from renewable and distributed sources of electricity. And when I talked to Jim Newcomb, one of the leaders of that project, he told me that one crack was that they saw people innovating in these systems in little places or in particular places, and they publicized those innovations so that other people could know about them and be inspired by them and imitate them. So that's an example of a crack. I guess the other crack in the same story is, wow, we see that solar and wind are becoming much cheaper as the technology advances. Rather than try to take on the system as a whole, why don't we try to get those technologies moving, and they'll change the rest of the system, which is in fact, which is a large part of what's happened. So again, I used to work in an electricity company, Pacific Gas and Electric. I worked in the energy business a lot in the early part of my career. And if you just look at the energy system as a whole, it seems like something that could never be changed. It is the way it is. Things are literally set in concrete. But in fact, it is changing. It can change. But the trick is to find the cracks and work there.
It's interesting. I think most people who think about systems think about finding a crack and expanding the crack, as in exacerbating what's already not working, calling highlight to it. And what you did in the story is the reverse direction. It reminds me of Richard Pascal's work on positive deviance, looking for the place where something is working better than you would expect it to work, figuring out what is it that's happening there, and then highlighting that so that more and more people adopt it, which is a little counterintuitive.
Yeah, so I'm not saying one or the other. I think both are true, but what positive deviance has in common with specific things that aren't working that people are agitated about or upset about or concerned about, what both of those sides of it have in common is you're looking for something that's already happening and you're working there and trying to work with it, enlarge it, chip it away, go through it, go around it, whatever, rather than saying, geez, the electricity system isn't producing the characteristic behaviors that we want. It's too expensive. It produces too much carbon dioxide. It's too centralized, whatever. Let's just figure out how to change the whole thing. That's what we're not doing.
Right. Okay. So find small pockets where I
Yeah.
can find people around that who will collaborate with me because they can see a positive result, or they can see a way through, or they can see a place of
Yeah.
expanding a crack. And then just steadily working with that crack. As you said, chipping away or drawing light through it or highlighting what's happening and hoping other people will adopt it. Okay.
Or we're going through it or going through there and then finding another one and another one and another one. But the key, I think, is to look at the specifics. And I'm a very abstract thinker. It has certain strengths, but it also has weaknesses. And I think for me, this idea of the specifics matters. You know, you mentioned you mentioned a friend of yours who was involved in legislation. There's a wonderful book about Lyndon Johnson when he was the leader of the Senate, the Democratic leader of the Senate, doing this thing which he was elected not to do, and he did do, around civil rights legislation. And in the one of the many volumes of Robert Caro's biography of Johnson, he tells the story about the historian Arthur Schlesinger going to visit Johnson, his ranch in Texas, and Johnson walks him through every single one of the Democratic senators in his caucus, however many those were, 50 something, and explaining for each one you know, where who they listen to, whether you call them at their home or their mistress's house, etc. But detail about every single one. And the point that what I found so amazing about the story was Johnson did this big thing, but by knowing the detail of, in this case, every person he had to work with, every senator in his caucus. It's a beautiful example.
It's I've seen this in company transformations more times than I can count, where the company transformation hasn't delivered on the promise that would have been seemed obvious and the plan seemed obvious. And you do all the obvious, organization things and systems things and people in charge of things and accountability things and all that stuff that we talk about. What every one of them I know missed the details that are way down the food chain in some ways of why a thing wasn't working the way it should be working, and people had created a workaround in order to get there. And that piece was the part nobody understood the detail of. And I say this to many leaders, as lack of fun as it is, particularly for conceptual, visionary thinkers, digging into those details is what you're going to have to do in order to make transformations happen.
Well, and to take a very, excuse me for this, but to take a very topical, super controversial example, the transformation which is occurring in the US government as we speak is, as far as I can tell, the result of very precise identification by the incoming administration or by the people who were preparing for the incoming administration about exactly which rule or law or department or system, often things that I, as an outsider observer, didn't even know existed, never heard of, wouldn't even think about, that if we do this or dismantle this or fire this person, then we can affect the transformation we want. So system transformation doesn't always go the way I want it to go, but it always has these characteristics that we're speaking about now.
Okay, so we have this notion of working with the cracks. One of the 7 habits. Finding a place where something is working better than you would expect, or finding a place where something is broken also. Looking into the details with others, trying to understand what is it about this, and then highlighting that and using that as a foothold to look for yet another crack and another crack and another crack. All right, so let's go to the second one, the one I think you're most famous for, which is this notion of collaborating with the enemy. But you say collaborating with people who are unlike you. Explain what does that look like? How do I do it? And why does it matter?
Yeah, so you're correct. I use different words for this because they all have slightly different connotations. And I said that working with cracks was something I hadn't thought of before. Collaborating with unlike others is something I've thought about a lot. Wrote another book about it, as you say, called Collaborating with the Enemy. But the point I'm trying to make here is not specifically the point about the enemy, meaning somebody who I think is injuring or harming me. That's a more specific point. But the more general point, which I'm covering in the book we're talking about, is working with people who are in a different part of the system or who differ from me or who differ with me. You could say unlike, or that I don't like, or that are unlikely. I mean, these are all just slightly different, all these words have slightly different connotations. But the point is that when we're talking about transforming a system, working just with our buddies, the people who agree with us, the people who we're used to working with, the people who think about things the same way we do, the people who are in the same part of the system as we are, usually isn't enough. And usually the collaboration, the effective collaboration is with people who have different positions or perspectives in the system. We may or may not agree with or like or trust. But together we can do more than I can just with my buddies. And the example I give in the book is a woman named Roseanne Haggerty, who runs an organization called Community Solutions, very famous in the United States for work on homelessness. And when I talked to her about her work, I found her describing that when they're working in a given city, it's not just with whatever the housing department of the municipality. It's often with bankers or sports teams or tourism authorities or developers or community leaders. I don't know what the most common, but her point was that I have to work with unlikely allies. That's where the breakthrough comes. And often and this is I think the not obvious point, often we have different reasons for wanting to work on this.
Yeah.
The tour, I mean, I'm just making this next example I'm making up, but often the tourism people want a city that's attractive for visitors. That might be different from the community activist that doesn't want members of their community not having housing. So the surprising thing about collaborating with unlike others is that often we agree that something needs to be done, but we have different reasons for wanting it done, but that's actually works well. That's the surprise, that often we don't have to agree on what the problem is or even what the solution is. We just have to agree that there's something that we could do together that would make it better.
So we agree that there's an outcome we want, why we want it, what the purpose is, what the solution looks like, the things we're willing to consider. We don't have to agree on. We just have to agree on the problem is worthy of solving. Have I restated your life's work in a reasonable way?
Yeah, we have to agree the situation is problematic. It may be problematic for you and me for different reasons. But we agree that it could be better and we could do more on that together than we can separately. But that's a surprise because most of us think, no, we have to agree. We have to have the same values. We have to have the same problem definition. We have to have the same vision. All of those things would be nice, but it's not true that they're required.
Okay, what I think is most interesting about this is there's a lot of focus, particularly in organizational life, around having a common purpose and a belief that a common purpose is what draws a team together and so on. And there's no question that we have to agree that we're sort of working in a common direction around a system, around a problem or around a goal or around something. I'd agree with that. But why I might want to work on it, why somebody else might want to work on it, what I think are the things to do, what somebody else thinks are the thing to do, don't have to be perfectly aligned. So I think we get a little over our skis on this whole sense of purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a double click on this that's important. That there's a difference between collaborating in an organization where we're all part of the same team and have ultimately are in a hierarchy, and that's different from the example I gave of the housing work, where in this case Roseanne's organization and the developers and the city council and the sports
Yeah.
franchise are not on the same team. So I think there's two ways this can go. But yes, I think if you're trying to get big things to change, the idea that everybody has to have the same purpose and the same problem definition and the same boss is not true.
Okay. All right. I love it. So we have working with cracks. We have collaborating with unlike others. I want to go to the third one, which is where you really started, acting responsibly. And I think all of us would say, yes, I act responsibly, but you have a particular meaning for this one. So explain and tell me why that matters.
Yeah, again, this was one that I hadn't thought about very much, but this book more than my others is based not so much on my experience as on talking with whatever 30 people I thought had done impressive system transformation work around the world, starting with Trevor Manuel and with all the others listed in the book. And so there were things they mentioned that I hadn't been thinking about, and this is one in particular. So there's a expression from the 1960s: if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. But years ago, Bill Torbert, who's a management professor in Boston, said to me, well, Adam, that's actually not the key point. The key point is if you're not part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. If you can't see how what you're doing is part of the reason things are the way they are, then it follows logically there's nothing you can do to change how things are except from the outside by force. So this I'd heard a long time ago, but I hadn't quite grasped its significance. And in that chapter, Habit 1, I interviewed Marcia Anderson, who's a medical doctor in the Canadian province of Manitoba, a First Nations woman. And we were talking about why she did what she did with respect to improving health outcomes in that system. And she used an expression I'd heard before, but I'd never really understood. If you spend any time in ceremonial situations with what in Canada are called First Nations and in the United States are called Native Americans, you'll often hear an expression, all my relations. And in the interview I did with Marcia, she mentioned this in passing. She said, well, this is really an all my relations perspective. And I said, well, I've heard that expression, but what does it mean? She said, well, it means that I'm thinking about not just what does this mean for me or for my immediate family, but for my larger kin, which, by the way, includes not just my family, but other non-human beings. So the question or the riddle that's posed in this interview, or in this chapter rather, is what does it mean to act with responsibility for all your relations? In other words, going back to Torbert's point, what is my role in the system? And from that, what is my responsibility? So, as I say, it's more of a riddle than a recipe, but I think it's in a way the most important chapter. I originally had it as my last chapter, but my granddaughter Siobhan Wilkinson, who did the beautiful illustrations of the book, said, no, this has to be chapter 1. And I think she's right. It is, the fundamental question is, what's my role in the system? What am I doing? And from there, what is my responsibility? And that's the basis for acting responsibly. It doesn't have a simple answer or a universal answer, but it starts with, what am I doing here?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you know John Ott's work, another person that I've interviewed on the podcast and a former classmate of mine as well, does community-wide transformation and teaches a process for doing community transformation. He's done some amazing work. Again, somebody we've talked to on the podcast. This is his starting point as well, that until you understand how you are acting in the system, how you're perpetuating the problem, how you're exacerbating the problem, how you are an actor in the system, then you're not prepared to do all the other things that are necessary in order to be able to transform the system. And he would argue that that is the stepping stone for doing what you do, which is to say collaborating with unlike others. So listening, his words would be listening to the voices of people who come from very different perspectives.
Yes, I think that's exactly it. And I would go further further along the same lines. Maybe it's not further than him. But when I focus on the enemy, those people that are doing these things, I mean, there may well be people who are doing things that are harming me or that are injuring me, who are objectively my enemies. But the question is, where's the focus of my attention? Is the focus of my attention on them and what they ought to do, or on me and what I need to do to make a contribution to changing things, which may well involve interacting or fighting with or pushing aside them, but the focus of the attention is different.
Yeah. Just to bring this back to corporations, as I work with teams that have intense conflict within the teams. And as you rightly say, there's a hierarchy and there's a team and there's already some sense of belonging together in some way. But when I work with teams that have intense conflict, 90% of the time, people believe that the other is the one that needs to change. And if you could please just explain, Wanda, to that other why they are so horribly wrong, then we will go on. Of course, each side thinks that. So getting each side to recognize that the other's perspective in some point is valid is usually the point at which there's a breakthrough. But that is also much easier said, Adam, as you know, than done, because we have our old story about why I'm right and the other is wrong.
Yeah. No, I think that's fundamental, and that's the focus of the revised version of Collaborating with the Enemy, which is this idea of going from things aren't the way I want them to be, therefore it's their fault. This is a big jump. And
Yeah.
if I classify everybody who disagrees with me or differs from me as the enemy, it's going to be hard to make progress. So I'm not saying you never have enemies, but I don't think we have as many as we think we do.
Yes, I think we're right about that one. There may be a few, but not that many. All right. I want to do one more. Granted, there are 7, but I love this one, looking for what's unseen. What does that mean, and why does that matter?
Well, again, that's one of the ones that I've worked with for a long time and is familiar to me, which is simply that we're all situated in a particular place, particular position in the systems we're part of, and that gives us a particular perspective, and we see certain things, and other things are invisible to us, or around the corner, or on the other side. And often, what we need to be able to move forward is see something we're not seeing. And the quickest, the simplest way to do that is to talk to somebody who's somewhere else and say, hey, what are you noticing? What do you see? What's going on for you? So that's the connection to the working with, the collaborating with unlike others.
All right. It strikes me that 3 of these, the 3 that we have talked about, are particularly related to each other. And I granted they all are, but this notion of I see myself as a part of the system and therefore a part of the problem, and that I'm willing to look at my role in perpetuating that particular problem. So that's acting responsibly. I am willing to collaborate with people who are unlike me, which is going to give me a different perspective on what is going on, and recognizing that we have some common reason for wanting to solve a particular situation or particular problem, even though we might do it for different reasons. When I'm collaborating with unlike others, it increases the chances that I'm going to see what's unseen, because I have a chance of hearing from them what they see. I got to be open to that one, which comes back to number 1. And it strikes me that that is probably the way we begin to find the cracks, the places in which things are working better or can be tackled in a small, very detailed way.
Yes, and in the text of the book, or in the illustrations of the book, you'll see that I use a honeycomb with these 7 ideas, and it's just to make the point, one, that they are interrelated, and you have teased out some of the interrelationships, but there is a common theme. There is a habit underneath the others, which I call, and this is the subtitle of the book, radical engagement. So the thing I took away from the interview with Trevor is there's a particular way of engaging with others, hands-on, leaning forward, curious, in relationship, rather than arm's length, dictating, arrogantly knowing it all. That underlying habit of radical engagement, the subtitle of the book is The Catalytic Power of Radical Engagement. That's the stance, the under the surface engagement with others and with the system. That's manifested in these 7 habits are manifestations or ways of working with this underlying orientation.
Right, right. Very powerful, radical engagement, hands-on, so into the details, leaning forward, in relationship with other people, curious, meaning that drive for openness and willing to hear those different perspectives and different points of view. Adam, if only we could all immediately adopt these 7 habits, I feel like we would all be in a better place in our lives, in our world, and in our organizations. So the 7 again: acting responsibly, relating in 3 dimensions, looking for what's unseen, working with the cracks, experimenting a way forward, collaborating with unlike others, and of course the one we haven't talked about, perseverance, and resting. So, Adam, great book. Really love the interview. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.